Welcome to Family Basics 101. I'm Dr. Bruce McClure, the local minister at the Prince George's Church of Christ, located at 7800 Central Avenue in Landover, Maryland. Throughout the week, we've talked about ways to avoid conflict, ways to avoid holiday disasters where people are gathered together for a happy occasion, and inevitably, sometimes life gets in the way and people will conflict, clash. And if you've ever noticed, it can turn a great happy time into a time of bitterness and despair that people later, after the holiday event has passed, now have to go back and try and repair it. Have you thought about this in terms of conflict's major hotspot? Cleveland Clinic's news service, in a December 21st, 2018 article, noted the major area of holiday conflict that erupts before the holiday and continues after the holiday. To the surprise of most people, it can be traced to in-laws or extended family. That was a surprise to a lot of people. Why can you trace this to in-laws or to extended family? Well, because family traditions surface during holidays. In-laws can be present in spirit through prior learned experiences by each individual at the gathering, how they shop, how they decorate, time for dinner, what they have for dinner, and those in-laws or that extended family may not physically be present, but those traditions will surface that were developed by those in-laws. Now, if by chance the in-laws show up in person, the conflict might escalate higher, much higher, due to attempts to show family loyalty or attempts to avoid conflict with the extended family or the in-laws through compliance with the family of origin's expectations. And it escalates the conflict, and it makes the holiday even more disastrous. Let's talk a little bit about some family recipes that conflict with each other when you bring these family constellations together. And I'm using the term recipes because we're talking about holidays, and I'm trying to keep this light and trying to keep you connected to the discussion. Family gatherings are filled with different personalities, with clashing traditions that, when used properly, will result in a great finish. Now, the operative is when used properly. Now, keep in mind that every family has recipes. Every family has different personalities. But when those things are used properly, like a good recipe, then it can result in a great finish. But imagine in your kitchen pantry, you can't use everything at one setting. If you do, it's going to ruin whatever you're trying to accomplish. So with these family recipes, family gatherings, a person can be filled with salt. Within families, there are just salty people. I'm not talking about just a drop of two, but I mean, they're just salty. But in certain food recipes, you need a lot of salt. There may be somebody that's a person that's filled with sweetness. Imagine, if you would, a canister of sugar. Every family will have a person that is just filled with sweetness. But there are certain recipes that just does not call for as much sugar or sweetness as others. But when used properly, they can make good end results. A person with just a little artificial flavor. Nothing wrong with using artificial flavor. There are recipes who call for just a little bit of flavor. But what about the person in the family recipe book that is filled with pure flavor directly from the bean, like nutmeg or vanilla? One time we were on vacation on a cruise, and we went to some place, and they had the freshest nutmeg. You could smell it. And we bought some. And it was a world of difference grating the spice nutmeg from the original ball than it was shaking it from a bottle. But there are great recipes that can use the pureness of the vanilla bean or nutmeg. And how does that play with a person who's only filled with a little bit of flavor? That they've got a little bit of sense of humor, but they don't have a lot. And yet you got people who can just kind of bring out the richness of what you're trying to prepare. What about a person whose temperament is simply that of being warm at best? And it's probably not that warm. Typically, if we're going to keep an oven on warm, you're talking about 175 degrees. But imagine needing something to remain warm. Well, that works well. But what if you need a person in that mix, or that person, a person may be in the mix, whose temperament is always medium to hot, 300 degrees to 450 degrees, 275 degrees to 500 degrees. Well, there's a place for that. Just like there's a place for an individual that has a warm temperature. But if those things are not blended correctly or utilized wisely, it can cause a lot of unnecessary conflict at family gatherings. Now, how do you avoid that? Well, have you ever shared recipes? Back in the day, I remember ladies getting together and they would share recipes. Recipes that one person did not have, another person may have. And they would just spend hours just trading recipes. Well, I wonder what would happen in relationships, family relationships, if individuals who are planning to come together for a major event had first spent time sharing recipes. Well, what do I mean? Sharing their life history, sharing their family traditions, sharing what is the story, the backstory behind why this is so important. A danger that frequently generates conflict during family gatherings is the fact that families do not talk about traditions or the history behind those traditions before making them the expectation of the day for everybody. Each family and each individual may have made specific tweaks to traditions and family values and personalize their newly modified expectations. So now these become the normalized expectations of everybody else. The problem is everybody else doesn't have a clue about what those expectations are and why they are so important. Unless these new expectations are shared from a place of love and understanding, conflict can arise that may have been avoided. When people have too explicit of expectations of others, it creates stress, and most people will do or behave in a manner to either avoid or extinguish the conflict or the stress. They're going to say, look, I don't want to be around. I'm not going to that event. If I go, I'm not going to participate. I'm not going to interact. If somebody gets in their face, or if somebody starts talking out of school, out of turn, then people will say, well, that's your opinion. That's not mine. That's the way you see life. That's not the way I see life. It can happen around something as simple, especially during November, December, January. The conversation around a football game can blow up a family gathering. People will come together and they want to make their favorite team everybody else's favorite team. There may be people who could care less about a specific sport. And unless that is handled properly, it will blow up the family gathering. There may be someone who has a special food that they think the world revolves around, and there may be another person at the event who despises that same food. But if we take time to share the history of those recipes, where they're coming from, it could be your great-great-grandmother's recipe. This comes from my family tradition 3 generations back. The time of gathering. The reason we gather at a certain time is because my grandfather, my grandmother, my great aunt, this was a tradition they created. But the reason was the gathering was always at 1 p.m. for them, because it was at 1 p.m. 50 years ago, on that date, a special date, that they met each other for the first time. Do you see how now you're adding clarity to why 1 p.m. is important? Let's conclude by looking at a biblical illustration. If you don't share recipes, how will people know? It will frustrate the daylights out of people about, where is this coming from? Why is this so important? Why is the person so dug in on this? In the book of Philippians chapter 3, verses 3 through 6, the Apostle Paul is going to write to a Gentile church and explain to these Gentiles some of his Jewish history. Why does he take the time to explain the Jewish history of who he is to the Gentiles? Because they didn't have any frame of reference to why he's now preaching to the Gentiles with such vigor. For we worship by the Spirit of God. Or we who worship by the Spirit of God are the ones who are truly circumcised. We rely on what Christ Jesus has done for us. We put no confidence in human effort, though I could have confidence in my own effort if anyone could. Indeed, if others have reason for confidence in their own efforts, I have even more. I was circumcised when I was 8 days old. I'm a pure-blooded citizen of Israel and a member of the tribe of Benjamin, a real Hebrew, if there ever was one. I was a member of the Pharisees who demanded the strictest obedience to the Jewish law. I was so zealous that I harshly persecuted the church. And as for righteousness, I obeyed the law without fault. Paul says, that's where I'm coming from. You need to know my history. But now I count all of these things as waste. See, Paul is saying, in order for you to understand why I'm now zealous about Christianity, you've got to know the old recipe that I followed. And you'll also understand why I hope you can trust me. You've heard the stories of me, the destroyer. You've heard the stories of me being the opposition to Christianity. But he said, I want you to understand the recipe that I followed. So now you can appreciate the recipe of Christ that I am following. As we move into celebrating with family, conflict may arise, but maybe you can be the catalyst of change to kind of change the trajectory of the family gathering by spending some time when families get together and say, hey, look, let's spend an hour or so just talking about family traditions. Share with me, share with us, share with the group your family traditions around holidays and how they came to be. And I'll share with you my family traditions and how they came to be. And if there's a sharing of the heart, in all likelihood, there's a greater appreciation for one another, and there's less conflict around the holiday, even spending money. Why? Tell me your family history about why it was so important to spend so much money on gifts, why it was so important to decorate, why it was so important for certain dishes to be cooked. See, once we start sharing recipes, then it's helpful in calming the conflict. I look forward to seeing you back in class again tomorrow. Don't be late and don't skip class.